We had 2.5 days of very fruitful discussion in this workshop, and now we are coming to the conclusion of the conference. Everything, all the questions you have for other participants, and we will end promptly at 7 p.m. studies at the University of Minnesota. He has published on modern literature and French literary theory. His most recent books include a beautiful title, in my opinion, Is Theory Good, the Transhuman, an essay on the aesthetic body, literature, and new technologies. He is currently completing a book on the resurgence of Gnostic motives in French modernity, and he will be talking to us under the title Understanding Antisemitism, Philosophy, Psychoanalysis, and Religion.
Well, thank you very, very much for this introduction. A huge thanks to the Van Leer Institute. Thank you to Daphna in particular very much, and to Shai, and to all my friends who are here. So there is a saying among French literary scholars. We say that literature leads to everything as long as you get out of it. And here I am talking about anti-Semitism and definition of anti-Semitism. So it is very challenging also, I want to say, to talk, to be the last speaker, because you feel like everything has been said already. So I hope I will bring something a little bit new. Understanding anti-Semitism is a daunting task. The plethora of explanations bear witness to the complexity and the lability of what some scholars have called the longest hatred or lethal obsession. In the following, I want to survey old and new theoretical trends that I find particularly helpful to identify some invariables of the anti-Semitic bigotry. Realizing that social paradigms shift and change, and that anti-Semitism remains, I wanted to focus today on metaphysical explanations rather than socio-economic theories. My first section is entitled simply Gaze. In the last years of the Second World War, Jean-Paul Sartre used his existential analytic method to understand anti-Semitism. He partly succeeded and partly failed. Those who contend that he failed argue that he was not able to understand the Jew qua Jew. The Jew for Sartre was a product of the anti-Semite's fantasy of his gaze. It is the gaze of the anti-Semite that creates the Jew. The objection to Sartre's approach is legitimate, but it does not take away that anti-Semite and Jew remains until today a virtuoso portrait of the anti-Semite of French stock, of the then recent collaborator with the Nazi regime and Vichy National Revolution. For Sartre, the anti-Semite is a textbook case of the man of bad faith. The latter is the man who lives in accordance with the belief that human beings have a predetermined essence and who does not realize that the essence of man is to have no essence at all, to exist before anything in particular, before any determination. Sartre famously summed it up in the proposition existence precedes essence, his axiom of freedom. In other words, the man of bad faith, in his case the anti-Semite, in this case, is not free. He submits himself to beliefs in natural and cultural determinations, blood and soil, social classes, race, religion, and so on. For him, man is a tree. He is rooted in a landscape, be it social or natural, and the Jew is precisely the one who does not belong to that landscape. Reactionary, there you go, man is not a cauliflower, that's Sartre citation. Reactionary thought fails to embrace the core principles of existentialist humanism. Existentialist humanism can be understood as a form of universalism that makes every human being equal before existence and death, and therefore every human being not only free to choose his own fate, but also forced to choose it, sentenced, as it were, to freedom. To wit, Sartre, anti-Semite, is an alienated consciousness. He wallows in the primitive world of the in itself, of beings and things that are glued or riveted to their essence, rather than capable of transcending it. He is an inauthentic being. So this diagnostic just after the war, the end of the war, was remarkable to be sure, yet it may have missed the point, i.e. that the Jew is neither free for itself, a consciousness freed from its supposed essence, nor an in itself riveted to its essence. Jewish being, or if you prefer Jewish factualness, has determinations that indeed precede existence. And so if Sartre was able to grasp something important about the psychology of French anti-Semitism, he fell short of understanding the specificity of anti-Semitism insofar as he did not engage with the concreteness of Jewish existence, and even with this troubling fact that the authentic Jew does not entirely choose his fate. What Sartre finally helped us understand was more the essence of xenophobia, racism, and French bigotry than the enigma of anti-Semitism. Second section is entitled Replacement. Now, one particular trait of Jewish existence is, well, particularism. Even though Sartre was sensitive to existence in situation, that is, concrete conditions of experience, and very suspicious of abstract universalism, he did not dwell on the subject of Jewish particularism, a stumbling block throughout the history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Today I cannot retrace that history. I will limit myself to some thinkers who have recently engaged, either favorably or critically, with the doctrine of Paul of Tarsus, arguably the first intellectual of Christianity. It is well known that the apostle brought to the Western world the idea that to be a true Jew, a fulfilled Jew, one had to renounce particularism. Paradoxically enough, to be a real Jew, one had to cease being a Jew, or at least one had to overcome a limited loyalty to the particular and a narrow understanding of Jewish existence. One had to open one's mind to the message of Jesus and accept him as the Messiah. In the first century CE, Paul's doctrine, as laid out in his epistles to the Gentiles, promoted the replacement of the letter with the spirit, the law with faith, circumcision of the flesh with that of the heart. Arguably, Paul's constitute the first narrative of emancipation, emancipation from an identity rooted in the flesh, in filiation, in genealogy. Paul wished to replace embodied filiation, the vertical, if you will, with symbolic brotherhood, the horizontal. Christians were to be brothers in Christ. This opened up the possibility of broadening the community, a community of love, agape, rather than a community rooted in law and embodied filiation. Paul's community could potentially embrace and include all the nations, Gentiles or Goyim, and turn particular Judaism into a universal creed. This was the meaning of Catholicism, the universal, the apostolic church. In the 1980s, French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, mainly known for an intriguing book on the postmodern condition, wrote very critically of the attempt by Paul and by Christianity in general to overcome Jewish particularism. For Lyotard, indeed, Paul provided the first theory of emancipation. He was the first modern. Here, modern designates a belief in the possibility of a total emancipation. As such, Christianity constituted the first grand narrative of modernity. Faith in Christ was supposed to free the Jews from their enslavement to the law, and the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross was meant to have freed all humankind once and for all. Then Lyotard considered the Enlightenment, Marxism, and modern science, all narratives that promised the emancipation of humankind from the shackles of heteronomy, i.e. the transcendent law, and childhood. Recall indeed Kant's definition of enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Modern for Lyotard, then, is any narrative that claims to free humankind from all forms of subjugation, inequality, and injustice. To be sure, this was a very idiosyncratic understanding of the concept of modern, but perhaps a useful one when it comes to grasping Paul's formidable intellectual and political coup de force. For Paul, the law and the letter condemned the Jews to a form of enslavement and even symbolic death. The letter kills, he famously declared. Under the law, one cannot be alive. The Jew must therefore free himself from the letter and liberate the spirit. Universalism, the Catholic, arises from that liberation. The Gentiles are invited to join the church and to become Verus Israel, the true Israel. In other words, the Jews, once converted, will be accomplished Jews, real Jews. Under the law, they will always remain incomplete, anachronistic, archaic, and unfinished work. The Jews had a great intuition, monotheism, and the rejection of idolatry, but Paul's epistle suggests that they failed to turn that intuition into a universal creed. Now, Lyotard, in his conversation with Paul in the 1980s, intimated that the Pauline narrative effected a symbolic violence that opened up the history of Christian antisemitism. He called this violence that of the hyphen, the trait d'union, between Jew and Christian. For Lyotard, this hyphen, rather than uniting or bridging Jew with Christian, meant instead the erasure of the Jew as falsus Israel and its replacement with the Christian. Lyotard rooted his philosophy in the idea that total emancipation is, strictly speaking, not possible. The Jews, for Lyotard, bear witness to this structural impossibility of overcoming an original grip, heteronomy, which means literally the law of the other. But against Lyotard's critique of the hyphen between Jew and Christian, French communist philosopher Alain Badiou in the 1990s reclaimed the legacy of Pauline universalism. For Badiou, Paul had coined the very first universalism, the one that would open up all ensuing narratives of emancipation, especially the Marxist-communist one. Drawing on Paul's overcoming of differences, there is neither Jew nor Greek, Badiou claimed that Christian universalism indicates the promise of genuine equality. Such a conception of universalism reproduces the Pauline coup de force denounced by Lyotard and turns the Jew in the flesh again into some obstacle to the promise of equality. And I hope Danny Trom is here somewhere, because the best book written, I think, on this coup de force and the way that the radical left has appropriated Paul is Danny and his book, La promesse et l'obstacle. So I'm very, very glad that he will be here for the round table. Now, in 2003, Lacanian linguist, I should say, Jean-Claude Milner, proposed one more critique of European universalism. It was in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, the Second Intifada and the war in Iraq, when a new wave of violent anti-Semitism broke out in France and in Europe. Milner diagnosed that post-war democratic Europe and its project of indefinite geopolitical expansion and perpetual peace, far from having overcome the plague of anti-Semitism, prospered on the very erasure of the Jews. The new Europe, for Milner, was virtually criminal with regard to the Jews. The striving for universal peace, the post-Shoah never again motto, was a way of promoting what Milner called an easy universalism, rooted in the empty expansion of human rights. That easy universalism he opposed to demanding universalism, exemplified by Jewish difference, and to a principle of limitation, for instance, the nation-state, rather than indefinite expansion. Not unlike Lyotard, Milner saw modern democracy as a project that sees Jews as an obstacle to indefinite progress and emancipation. Finally, Jews, according to Milner, are the embodiment of an irreducible difference that Enlightenment and modernity have attempted to suppress. Since the emancipation in the 18th, 19th centuries, the Jews have always been construed as a problem in need of a solution, based on two cornerstone differences: generational, child, parents, and sexual, male, female. Judaism resists allegedly being resolved or liquidated in a democratic modernity that tends to level down all differences. I leave it to you to appreciate the limits and even the danger of Milner's theory, the least of which being that Jews somehow do not belong to European Enlightenment, that the rise of early 21st century anti-Semitism is structurally linked to the European Union, and that the latter is a disguised rehash of Nazi imperialism. Next section is entitled, Id, not Yid, Id. All right, I will now turn to the psychoanalytic explanation for anti-Semitism. American scholars are notoriously no longer well disposed towards psychoanalysis. Even the disciplines of psychology and psychiatry have rejected Freud's legacy as some sort of relic of the pre-scientific method. And yet, there is, maybe I'm wrong, someone will tell me. And yet there is something quite intriguing in an analysis of anti-Semitism based on an exploration of the Western id. Freud, persecuted by the Nazis in Vienna and in exile in London, published his Man, Moses, and Monotheism in 1939. That book, a testament of sorts, was not meant to be scientific but quasi-literary. In fact, Freud presented it as a historical novel. He was in search of what he called the historical or ahistorical truth, not so much a factual truth, but an unconscious one. Therefore, the reader could not expect sound, factual, empirical evidence. In his theoretical fiction, Freud argued that Moses was not a Jew, but an Egyptian, that the monotheism he imposed on the Hebrew slaves, whom he liberated and then led to the Promised Land, came from previous Egyptian avatars of monotheism, and that the Hebrews who resented the imposition of such a constraining and repressive legislation murdered, or at the very least attempted to murder Moses, a father figure. That murder, actual or attempted, was then forgotten, Freud says repressed, and returned in the form of guilt. Jews would be bound by that guilt based on the return of the forgotten, attempted murder of the symbolic father Moses. Granted, such speculation is far-fetched. And yet, even though the account is purely speculative and factually fragile, it offers an inspiring theory, what we could call a theoretical fiction. Again, in that book, Freud was not aiming at scientific truth. His was an attempt at laying out a very personal, some even say autobiographical speculation about the archaic origins of anti-Semitism, based in part on the psychoanalytic method. But what does that theoretical fiction have to do with anti-Semitism? What does it accomplish for our understanding of anti-Semitism? Now, recall that Freud was writing his book in the midst of anti-Semitic persecutions. One of his purposes was to understand the irrational violence unleashed upon European Jews. The Jews in Freud's Oedipal scenario are the people who refuse to acknowledge the murder or the wish to murder the father. The Christians, by contrast, acknowledged this murder, and in the Christian narrative, the son is put to death in order to cleanse the sins of humankind. But what is interesting is that Jewish refusal to admit the murder, or the attempted murder for that matter, became a curse for the Jews throughout the history of Christian Europe, as if the Jews were the incarnation of a lingering, interminable guilt that could not be cleansed because it is repressed, deeply buried in the unconscious. The Jews, as it were, stand as the living witnesses to a suppressed, traumatic memory. Now, Lyotard, whom we have already encountered, took up where Freud left off, again in the 1980s. In a book dedicated to the Nazi philosopher Martin Heidegger and his, at best, contemptuous relation to Judaism, Lyotard took Freud's historical novel seriously. For him, the Jews, in this sense written without a capital J, designate an original, unconscious affect that Lyotard characterized as the memory of the forgotten, la mémoire de l'oublié. They designate a disturbance within the West and Europe. This unconscious affect would haunt the West, and the West will never cease trying to get rid of that haunting disturbance. Lyotard was reproached for using scare quotes to mention the Jews, thus suggesting that he was not talking of real historical Jews and that he was turning them into a mere metaphor. It may be true, but at the same time, anti-Semites do not consider the real Jews either in their hatred. It is well known that anti-Semitism can bloom even in the absence of Jews. Instead, the anti-Semite reacts to a psychic representation of the Jews. To be sure, that psychic and repulsive representation has effects in the real world and on real Jews, from conversion, ghettoization, pogroms, and genocide. Now, in a 2018 book, French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, who died quite recently, a disciple of Jacques Derrida, argued that Jews constitute an internal outside or an external inside of Europe. In the European unconscious, provided that such a thing exists, Jews are a destabilizing principle. Nancy's speculation is very close to Lyotard. The European psyche, he claims, is split between a striving for autonomy, to wit, modernity, and the remainder of heteronomy, to wit, an archaic attachment to the call from God. Nancy further suggests a psycho-anthropological theory of sibling rivalry built on Judaism. Indeed, Christianity is yearning for a self-foundation, for an auto-fondation. It strives to be its own origin. The younger does not forgive the elder. In the most compelling part of his argument, Nancy identifies anti-Semitism as a case of European self-loathing, a phenomenon that is inscribed in the genetic code of European civilization. Nancy argued that European civilization is split between a striving for autonomy and rationality on the one hand, and on the other hand, a longing for an ideal and spiritual accomplishment, the sacrifice then of power, of materiality, wealth to something higher. Nancy sees this split at work in the history of the Christian church. The Catholic Church has built its worldly empire by preaching its rejection of mundane affairs and of worldly considerations. As a result, European anti-Semitism appears as a case of psychological projection. The Jew comes to embody everything that modern Europe hates about itself: money, power, democracy, technique. Nancy concludes his argument with the metaphor of paranoia, a paranoia that would be at the level of a whole civilization. A threat that originates in oneself is turned into a threat that originates from the other. And my next section is entitled Myth. By the end of the war, the same year that Sartre was writing Anti-Semite and Jew, and 1 year before his death, 1944, philosopher Ernst Cassirer published a pièce de circonstance that purported to understand the Nazi campaign that led to the final solution. Cassirer's hypothesis rests on a distinction between Judaism, especially prophetic, and political religion, especially Nazism. Where prophetic Judaism disrupted myth and replaced it with ethics, Cassirer claims, Nazism marked an interruption of ethics and a return to myth. To be sure, such a return was not a return to the original experience of myth in ancient Greece, but to what we could call a myth of myth, an artificial, manufactured production of myth for industrial times and modern man. This myth was laid out by Alfred Rosenberg in his notorious Myth of the 20th Century, published in 1930, a major inspiration of Nazi ideology and an influence on the remythification of politics by the Third Reich. Prophetic Judaism, according to Cassirer, had defined a religious ethics that does away with images as conveyors of myth. No myth can exist without images, Cassirer tells us, and thus Nazi politics had to return to those images to the front stage. To understand Cassirer more concretely, think, for example, of the cinema of Hitler's movie maker official Leni Riefenstahl, and the collective narcissism that her movies nurtured. At the movie house, ordinary Germans would be invited to recognize an imaginary, ideal version of themselves as though in a mirror. And the so-called Aryan race was meant to be a race of gods, and Joseph Goebbels, in his interwar novel Michael, oh my God, this thing is, okay, declared that politics, I quote the novel, the 1920s, politics is the plastic art of the state. This aestheticization of politics, such was Walter Benjamin's very well-known expression, was really thought-provoking definition of fascism in the 1930s by Walter Benjamin. I think this image is actually a very good example of this, sculpting the people and the Jew with liberal democracy, if you want, democracy, which cannot make, if you will, a man or a new man who would be like sculpted and a beautiful form. So the plastic art of the state, politics, must extract forms and images out of the formless mass or crowd of the people, if you want. To produce those forms and images, one had to invent a formless abject other and eliminate it in the same way as a sculptor shapes his material by removing matter. This formless other will be the anti-mythic people, the Jews whose collective and individual body makes neither image nor race, a counter-image, if you will, or Gegenrasse, anti-race. Cassirer further argues that by condemning idolatry, Judaism had renounced anthropomorphism, the very idea that the gods are human, and the converse proposition that humans, that is Aryans, are like the gods. By contrast, the likeness to God in Judaism is not anthropomorphic. It is a likeness without likeness, as it were, a similitude without simile. But Judaism brought about yet another disruption, Cassirer intimated, the interruption of human sacrifice, an interruption willed by God himself when he says Abraham's offering of Isaac. This would radically transform the relation of man to God. With the interruption of sacrifice arises a conception of individual responsibility and the emergence of conscience. By contrast, Nazism, through its claim to returning to primitive religion, abolished individual responsibility and replaced it with collective guilt and punishment. Furthermore, Nazism unleashed the instincts allegedly repressed by monotheism. Literary critic George Steiner went as far as to suggest that Nazism was a natural reaction to the stifling of the soul brought about by the Jewish repression of the animist and pagan tendencies. I paraphrase here Steiner. It's not me thinking, it's a paraphrase. The Jews were slaughtered in the Holocaust not so much for having killed God, Steiner argues, but for having invented him and thereby stifling human aggressive tendencies. See that via such intellectual construction, Steiner illustrates the risks inherent in theorizing anti-Semitism. His extreme rationalization suggests that explaining anti-Semitism can amount to justifying it. To go back to Cassirer, his musings have only value if one agrees to limit Judaism to the prophetic, maybe, a Judaism that strives for universalism, the overcoming of nationalism, and peace among nations. It is nonetheless a very intriguing theory, especially if one sees prophetic Judaism as a herald of Christian universalism and even of the Marxist revolution, and if one admits that Nazi anti-Semitism was also a delayed rebellion against the Christianization of pagan Europe and an attempt at recovering Nordic pre-Christian past. And my last section is entitled Conspiracy. And by way of a conclusion, is it time? I've got 2 more minutes? Or? Okay. By way of a conclusion, I propose to reflect upon the new challenges posed by a siege-like mentality in the age of post-truth, social media, and fake news, and its correlation with anti-Semitism. Such thinking involves the fear of being under siege from an imaginary enemy. It is a form of collective paranoia that nurtures a conspiratorial mindset. In the last century, totalitarian regimes have exploited the manufactured feeling of besiegement by a vaguely defined enemy via state propaganda. In the cyber era, conspiratorial thinking travels at the speed of light, and anyone with access to social media can spread fake news. If propaganda is still the monopoly of the state in totalitarian or autocratic regimes, in Western democracies, it has become privatized and tailored to the expectations of specific communities and specific collective or even individual prejudices. The theme of conspiracy to enslave the Gentiles to Jewish masters has recently been recycled via the myth of the Jews as initiators and main beneficiaries of slave trade. But it was already one of the themes of racist anti-Semitism in the 30s and 40s, an anti-Semitism built on the belief in the Jewish plan to weaken and to subjugate the so-called Aryans. So I shall submit a hypothesis on the relation between conspiratorial thinking and anti-Semitism and suggest that conspiracy theory may have some ancient, archaic, and mythic roots. Scholars of mysticism Gershom Scholem and Hans Jonas have argued that the Gnostic worldview has long overlapped with anti-Judaism. Historians of religions identify as Gnosticism the heterogeneous collection of writings that form the corpus of heterodox gospels deemed heretical by the Church. In the 2nd century of our era, Marcion of Sinope, I don't know how to pronounce his name in English, Marcion de Sinope, uncoupled the gospel from the Hebrew scripture. For Marcion, the God of the Hebrew scripture was the evil God, while the God of the gospel was the good and loving. Jesus could not be Jewish because he was embodiment of love. It is not by chance that Nazi theologians turned to Marcion to de-Judaize Jesus. The Gnostics believed that the world was created by an evil inferior demiurge, none other than the God of the Hebrew scripture, and that the true God was alien to this world. I suggest that the evil power attributed to the Jews builds on ancient beliefs, which were later on secularized in racial pseudoscience. The conspiratorial worldview, likewise, rests on a Manichaean and apocalyptic struggle between those who are endowed with a special knowledge, Gnostics, and the agents of evil. Furthermore, it is possible to understand conspiratorial thinking as an inversion of the all-powerful hand of God and of theodicy in divine justice. For the believer, in conspiracy theories, a hidden hand is the prima causa of all the negativity in the world, of all the machinations that contribute to the ills of the age. We are witnessing today a resurgence of conspiratorial thinking, amplified by the exponential growth of those new technologies. And I argue that conspiracy theory is a form of Manichaean gnosis that allows a group of self-proclaimed initiates to point to an enemy and divide the world into light and darkness. Such thinking transcends society, and society can be found among new populists on the far right and the far left. In the wake of the death of God and disruption of the belief in divine justice, at a time of great derangement and great disorientation in a globalized world, we are witnessing the emergence of new forms of religious thinking and the return of so-called stigmatized, repressed, or marginalized knowledge. The manufacture of conspiracies is the vehicle of this new religious thinking. What we call fake news and post-truth testifies to a new collective magical thinking that there is some kind of a demonic cause to the disorientation, to the alienation of man in the new global disorder. That demonic cause will really fail to be the Jews. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Professor Bruno Chaouat, and the floor is now open to questions and comments, and we need a mic. So, we have Professor Aveilous, please.
Thank you so much, Bruno. This was a tour de force. You really took us through so many thinkers. I wanted to ask you a question of methodology. It may sound petty, but I think it's a bit less petty than it sounds. I confess that I have a bias for parsimonious explanations and interpretations. That is, the interpretations that are the simplest. So that's my first remark. Then second remark, you seem to conflate, anti-Judaism in the immediately post-classical world, in the Christian world, and then modern anti-Semitism. So I wanted to ask you, why this conflation. I'm sure you yourself thought about it, since many people would argue that there is an important difference between the two or the three. And then to go back to my point about parsimonious explanation, if we think about modern anti-Semitism, of course, it relies on a cultural background, on well-established mythologies. But then, you know, somebody like, I think Götz Ali is his name, will tell you that in Vienna, around at the beginning of the 20th century, the city was 90% Catholic, and there were 9% of Jews. And that Jews accounted at the same time 90% of the lawyers and more than half of its physicians, for example. And so Götz Ali goes on making what I think is a very simple assumption, that envy played a huge role in the anti-Semitism. It's simple, but that's my first point about parsimony. So I guess my question is one of methodology. Why did you conflate all of these different forms of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism? And two, don't you think that, or do you think that sometimes a parsimonious explanation might be called for, perhaps?
Yeah. Do I respond now, or do you take other questions? Other questions?
You want to collect? Would you like
sure.
to collect? Okay.
Thanks. Actually, there's no reason you should help solve my problem, but my thinking about anti-Semitism has been disturbed by reading, I think it's called Lapidot. You'll know the book.
Lapidot, yeah.
Yeah.
I've not read the book yet, though.
Oh, okay.
It's recent. It came out recently. I've not read it. Yeah.
So, well, people will correct me if I get it wrong. I'll only take a minute to. I mean, like he. As opposed to the idea that the anti-Semite is just projecting all his or her stuff onto the Jew, and the Jew is in a way a blank slate in that process, which maybe that's a bit like what Sartre says, but
pretty much.
Lapidot is I mean, I really don't understand it in detail, but he's saying that there's an epistemological issue in anti-Semitism, that knowledge is at stake, and that if one goes with the simple position of what he calls anti-Semitism, where one sort of just rebuffs all of this projection, you're left with a denial of the actuality of Jewish collective existence. So I'm not sure that it's fair to him to say that he's saying that there's a grain of, I may be going badly wrong here, that anti-Semitism has an object. It's like, I don't know if he's saying that there's a grain of truth in it, but it really upsets the apple cart of just throwing it all back, and I'm really confused about that, because it's not what I've thought for a long time. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good. Go ahead.
Thanks. So one of the ways that, you know, one of the ways that I sort of read your intervention is that there are really interesting and sometimes hard to easily or parsimoniously quantify, you know, themes and modalities that resurface over time and in really interesting ways about anti-Semitism. To the extent that that's sort of part of, you know, what you're doing, I guess I'm wondering how you might relate your talk with, I guess, kind of the central preoccupation of the workshop, which is, you know, how useful are definitions of anti-Semitism? Is anti-Semitism amorphous or just anything, or, you know, is there something to be gained by trying to be clear about what anti-Semitism is or is not? And yeah, I'd be really curious if you could relate your talk to that broad question. Thanks.
Perhaps, would you like now to respond to some of these?
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to. So okay, so Eva, thank you so much. Simple, yeah, I agree. Simple explanations can be interesting, but I'm not a sociologist, so I really have focused on theory and philosophy, as I said, and I also this actually paper is really a summary of a chapter of a book that is coming out with Cambridge on understanding on antisemitism, and so I wanted to do mainly a survey of some recent or less recent theories of explanation. But the problem I had was that anti-Semitism seems to remain throughout the centuries, and I agree, or at least Jew hatred, whatever you want to call it, and the paradigms are changing, and the paradigms in society are changing, and the economy and the infrastructures are changing. However, it seems like there is an invariant of anti-Semitic or Jew hatred. And because of that, I thought that going to more metaphysical explanations would be, at least for me, more productive, despite the fact that I have huge respect for all the sociological, socioeconomic, Hannah Arendt, Adorno, Frankfurt School, and so on. I know those theories somehow, but I think they are great. But for me, I really wanted to go to something that had to do with some kind of the root of the invention, maybe of monotheism, and this kind of imposition of the law, and why is it that today there is again some forms of conspiracies that return to this idea that we are basically manipulated by those Jewish machinations. It's almost the same rhetoric of machination that, by the way, you find in the Cahiers Noirs, in the black notebooks by Heidegger. The word machination, some Heideggerians are here probably in German, is used. So this idea of a machination resonated with me because I work on Gnosticism now, and especially on the way that Gnosticism what you were describing is a sort of anti-Sartrean, I think, a theory of anti-Semitism, meaning that the Jew is not a blank slate, and you don't just project your own neurosis, right, or little neurotic problems on the Jew, but that there is something more, there is a Jewish factualness, which, by the way, I mentioned, in sort of the facticité juive, there is this Jewish factualness that is there. And that's interesting because the way you describe Lapidote, and again, I'm not going to engage in the book because I have not read it, but it reminds me of Bernard Lazare, who in the 19th century, in the 1880s, was actually writing a book called Antisemitism and its causes, its origins and causes, history, whatever. And his take was very much that the Jews played a role, a significant role. That goes back maybe to the idea that the Jews in Vienna, owned 5% of certain positions and so on. So that the Jews basically play a role. And then what's interesting with Bernard Lazare is that 10 years after the Dreyfus affair, he completely disowned his own theory and his whole history about the causes of anti-Semitism and wrote his extraordinary, short, extremely poignant kind of testament called Le Fumier de Job. What is it in English? Le Fumier de Job? Job's... thank you so much. Yeah, and it was very, very poignant. It was a way of saying, well, there is Dreyfus, and anyway, nothing is going to, account basically, and certainly not what the Jews do. It's not going to account for Jew hatred. Does it make any sense?
Of course it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Because he's saying that anti-Semitism is inadvertently implicit with.
Okay.
And there was another question about what it brings to this conference. So I don't know what it brings. You tell me, maybe nothing. But I think it's important to try to theorize some ways to theorize, and this understanding of anti-Semitism can only bring something to our attempt at defining what passes for anti-Semitism. There is a certain rhetoric which I find on the radical left and radical right that is so incredibly resonant with century-old, if you will, expressions of Jew hatred that it's, let me give you an example. Maybe it responds indirectly to Moshe Behar, who I hope is still here, maybe not, if he's not here. Maybe not, I'm sorry. So anyway, because I think Moshe Behar was saying that it's on the radical left, it's only a problem of Palestine and Israel. But I am not sure about that, because I'll just give you an example. In my university, there is a department of gender studies and women and gender studies. At some point there was the Gaza war. Which one? The most recent one. When was that? You tell me, because there are so many that I don't even know. But anyway, there was a recent war in Gaza, and during that war in Gaza, the Center for Women Studies and Gender Studies decided to make a statement about Israel-Palestine. I don't know why, because normally they make statements about women or gender inequality or LGBT or queer issues. But they made a statement. The statement said, we condemn, the settler colonial state and the usual rhetoric, fine. And we also call for dismantling neoliberalism, capitalism, and this I quote, cis heteronormativity. So Israel, the Jews, if you will, maybe not the Jews, or maybe the Jews, stand for all those bad things. Does it make any sense? So if they stand for all those bad things, it means that it's not just the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's something beyond that. It's a prima causa, it's a sort of cause diabolique, enfin, demonic cause again, I think. Because otherwise there would be no reason to talk about cis heteronormativity with regard to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Does it make sense? Or? Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we have about 10 more minutes and a few more people who would like to ask, please.
Thank you. My name is Noach Benning. I'm with Manuel at the Vidal Sassoon Center. I have 3 short questions. The first relating to psychoanalytic terminology and your thinking here, just because I've seen, maybe you've seen this as well, Slavoj Žižek's seminar on anti-Semitism, which you can find on YouTube, from the European Graduate School. And there he goes into detail about how his theory, and this made sense to me as someone who studied Nazism and Auschwitz, basically, and also from as my own political engagement here, basically the Nazis were, good socialists who had a fetish problem. They had a fixation on the Jews. Mm-hmm. And he uses this terminology of fetish, not projection. And the problem is that you cannot cure somebody of their fetish. It's something that's holding up their entire construction. They won't let it go. But the merit of this is that it shows that they actually, were kind of good guys, and this makes sense to me in a sense, if they didn't have that fetish. So why did you choose the maybe a little bit older terminology of projection? The second one, my second question has to do with the general mahalach, the progression of your argument, which is of course not entirely clear to me at the moment because it's in pictures, right? And I can't recap it right now. But it did seem to me that you're kind of like indicating at the end, you recognize this Manichaean moment in modern anti-Semitism, and you seem to indicate that it's on a rise. We're facing this large black wave, and I wanted to ask, why is this not what Huntington called in 1990, le revanche de Dieu? This is the result of the clash of civilizations, which is more and more religious, and in this case, it makes it more anti-Semitic. It's not necessarily le revanche, Gnosticism. And my final one question is, as you're dealing with psychoanalysis and this specific period, you did not make any mention of Jung's book on Zarathustra, 2 volumes written between 1934 and 1939. Why did you omit it?
And let's, David Feldman.
Thank you very much, Bruno. In a way, trying to address the question and sort of mediate what your lecture brings to the conference, and to ask you a question based on that question, which is to say that it seems to me that a lot of what you were talking about were different articulations of what one might call, of what people call supersessionism. And different articulations of the opposition between Hebraism and Hellenism. And And absolutely, those tend towards a denigration of Jews and of Judaism. But in general, they don't figure Jews as powerful. On the contrary, most of them, historically, have figured Jews as finished, as people whose moment in history has passed. Whereas conspiracy theory and what you figure as the Gnostic tradition does the reverse. So what I'm asking you to do, that in a way, the sort of flowing narrative that you gave collapsed supersessionism into Gnosticism. But it seems to me that there's a rupture there. And I wonder if you could say something to explain that rupture when the denigration of Jews becomes truly dangerous.
Okay, let's take briefly two more comments. Amos Goldberg and then Ashley.
Thank you very much. I want to follow on David's comment and ask, perhaps you start with this intuition that history changes, but anti-Semitism, you will always somehow track anti-Semitism, but perhaps you are somehow caught within a vicious hermeneutic circle because you put many very different, you put under this signifier anti-Semitism very different phenomena. So once you call them all anti-Semitism, you see them as a series of one kind. But perhaps they have less in common, but more differences between them, as we just heard. And they are not all one thing, but once you put them under one signifier, you call them, you invent them as anti-Semitism. You don't track them as anti-Semitism. You invent them once putting this whole very different historical and sociological phenomena under one signifier, which is anti-Semitism, and therefore you invent the phenomena and not track it.
Ashley Meyer-Tiban.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I hate to be the guy who says I have a comment instead of a question, but I have a comment. But I'm going to follow it with a very provocative question. First of all, I want to thank you for bringing the Gnosticism metaphor, which I've only been into very recently by reading literature on conspiracy theories. And it's one of those perspectives, once you read it, you're like, Eureka, and you see so many things through it. And I think that many political activism in many directions tend to construct these kind of metaphysical, diabolical and non-materialistic conception of what it is they're opposed to. And it can be the Jews, it can be capitalism, it can be communism, it can be Islam, it can be settler colonialism. It's all these categories that are not thought of as material categories, but as really absolute evils around which we construct our identities. However, my provocative question is this way. Do you not think that to some extent, and for understandable reasons, in the Jewish world, we also sometimes construct anti-Semitism this way? So we sometimes also might see anti-Semitism as some sort of non-materialistic, absolute evil, diabolical force which is present all over the world and that some sages are able to teach us about.
That's good.
Yeah, I'll add one further question, just to make sure that I understood the argument. So it seems to me that you were tracing a variety of understandings of anti-Semitism, and then in the last part you offered your own sort of take on it, and it seemed to me that you were suggesting a difference between the last one and the previous, and that somehow the previous explanations marked the Jews as the other of enlightenment, of universalism in different ways, I wonder, and that yours is actually putting the Jews on the side of enlightenment against sort of conspiracy theories and theories of untruth. And first is a question of whether this captures something of what you wanted to say, and then also then the question would be, is there an advantage of one essentialization of the Jews over another essentialization of the Jews in the story? And sort of to bring it back to the conversation, about the relationship between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, and how we could see the relation between the two. Not that was the move, but it brought that to question. Thank you. And
okay, thank you very much. So to the psychoanalysis. So I am not familiar with Zizek's way of engaging with or replacing projection with fetish. I think it's probably very productive, but I'm not sure what he is accomplishing by that. But I'm going to take a look at it. I did not understand what you meant by the antisemitism as a symptom of the rise of the clash of civilization. I'm not sure I understood. Maybe you want to clarify. Maybe we have no time, or maybe we can talk about it after. And I am absolutely not familiar with Jung on Zarathustra. I'm very sorry. So thank you so much for your question. It's really great, and it really points to something that is missing in this survey, if you will, or in those vignettes. There is a rupture, right, between a replacement and, in other words, anachronism or fossilization, or the vestigial, if you will, Jew who basically is no longer relevant, right? It's not relevant. So that's the history of Christianity, I would say, anti-Judaism. What I should have said is, and maybe I did not insist on that enough, is that there is another tradition in Christianity, which is the heterodox Christianity, which is what I call Gnosticism, for lack of a better word, and I know that there are thousands of debates about that. Does not exist. It's like anti-Semitism does not exist, right? So Gnosticism does not exist either. But let's call it Gnosticism or heterodoxy, if you prefer, or heresies, as they used to say. And I think that there you have something which is very, very much on the side of the all-powerfulness of the evil demiurge and a sort of rejection of so of the creation in general, and of the author of the creation is this evil figure. So I would say that therefore on the one hand you have replacement supersession, which indeed sees that sometimes they overlap, right? Because sometimes you can have a sort of revolutionary Marxist, Bolshevik, whatever. You have the revolution, you have a communist regime, and the Jews are still very powerful, despite the fact that they are irrelevant. Does it make any sense? They are completely irrelevant because what does that mean? They are particular, but what is it? But at the same time, they are the evil doctors, and they are those dangerous people. So they overlap, so it's not like, but you've got these two sort of parallel tradition, which begins maybe with the Gospel of John, in a way, where you have the sort of secessionist reading of the Gospel of John, where the Jews are basically the children of Satan, right? So you have the children of Satan, they are very all-powerful, very dangerous, etc., ominous. And then you have, St. Paul and the whole Catholic tradition, and the Apostolic tradition, where you have replacement and supersession, and they are just, okay, they don't understand anything. They are blind, like the synagogue and so on and so forth. So we're going to enlighten them. And then in that sense, they are benign to an extent, okay? So does it respond, or, yeah? Martina?
Actually, we've run, there were two more further questions that you were asked, right? Amos asked, right? Did you respond?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, Amos. So I invent the concept by subsuming all those expressions under the concept, right? So that begs the question of whether we can even talk about anti-Semitism. We can talk about, and that also, in a way, it puts into question my methodology, like Eva was saying. In other words, since there are so many different expressions of, what do you want to call it, Jew hatred or persecutions of Jews that is real in history, I think we can talk about it, then how do you account for those transfigurations since the social conditions, the economic, the infrastructure, the cultural, the culture is shifting. You have enormous paradigm shift in early modernity, medieval, early modernity, modernity, post-modernity, and whatever. And nonetheless, I think we may or we may not agree, almost, that there is a sort of invariable, let's say, prejudice, and sometimes prejudice that is being acted out, right, in Europe, for example, but not only, in Pittsburgh and so on and so forth, okay, like very recently. So, I was trying to understand this invariability that of course progress through many variations. That's why I am not totally convinced by the paradigm of rupture or total rupture when it comes to the history of anti-Semitism. So, but I don't know. I think Nirenberg is the one to go to, actually. David Nirenberg, wonderful book, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. He did something like that, which is questionable in a way, right? Because he goes back to antiquity and retraces the way that the Western tradition has basically built itself, identified itself against something that you can call the Jews. You replace them, or you can say Jews will not replace them because we have already replaced them. Right? That's the whole idea. So okay.
Okay. So
right.
Ashley had a question, if you'll recall, about whether anti-Semitism hasn't formed into this sort of metaphysical entity. Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, it's a great question. Yes. Oh yes, your provocation. I love it. I don't know. Jewish paranoia, right? I mean, we see that kind of demoniac or demonic force, and we are completely upset. I would respond that we have perhaps some good reasons to be paranoid. It's a very stupid response, right? But nonetheless, it's there. I mean, you know, when you live in France, and you do, and you see, you know, the most striking and traumatic experience of my life. Let's say, these last 30 years, was Toulouse in 2012. That was for me the most traumatic moment, maybe a turning point even, okay? So when you see that kind of things happening, it's very hard not to be a little bit paranoid, but I agree with you that there is lots of Jewish sort of obsession and even a sort of construction of some kind of an arch enemy that is everywhere, and that is the anti-Semite. So I would not disagree with you on that.
So we're almost out of time. If there's one last short question.
Very short. I'm just surprised that you...
The microphone.
I'm just surprised that you got to Gnosticism, because in the Catholic tradition you have, for example, Isidoro de Sevilla in the 7th century. He spoke about Jews and the Antichrist. And probably before that, I just don't know enough. But on them afterwards, until 65, until the Vatican II. So it's not exactly heterodox, it's quite very orthodox.
It's because I want to salvage Christianity from all those accusations. Because I have a Christian fetish. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point to end at. The keynote. Thank you very much, Professor Chaouat. And we will move now immediately, I think, not necessarily. And we will move immediately to the round table. I'd like to call the 4 participants in the round table to join me here. At this end, this is a highlight of the workshop. So as we're organizing and the 4 panelists are joining, let me just say a brief word about the purpose of this round table titled Antisemitisms, in the plural, a variety of meanings. So the idea here is really to have an engaged discussion of some of the questions that have been raised in preparation for the workshop, and also have come up, I think, even more importantly, during the workshop. And I'll just mention a few of them that got us going, and I'm sure that the participants will bring to the table some of their own concerns. So I guess one question is, what is at stake in defining anti-Semitism today? An implicit question that became explicit during the workshop was whether definitions are good, not only to the Jews, but whether definitions are good in general, whether we need definitions. How has the Israel-Palestine Jewish-Arab conflict become intertwined in the definition of anti-Semitism, and with what consequences? What is the relationship, if any, between the fight against anti-Semitism and other struggles against racism and discrimination? And I think one question that also became very clear in the past 2 days concerns localities and the geographies of anti-Semitism, and whether it makes sense to talk about a definition and sort of a global definition of anti-Semitism, or whether we need to be, or to what extent we need to be attuned to local variations as this discussion takes place. And this is a good way, a segue into the conversation. We have here 4 participants teaching at different universities in France, in Israel, and in Germany, and in the US. And so I will introduce the 4 of them in turn. I think I'll go by the order in the program, unless you mind otherwise, which means that we will begin with Professor Dani Tom. Each of the speakers will be speaking for about 10 minutes in the first round, and then we'll see how things go. Obviously, we'll open it up for a conversation with the audience here, and if people at home have questions, feel free to write them, and I'll receive them directly to my WhatsApp, so they tell me. So, Professor Dani Tom is a senior researcher at the CNRS. He teaches at the École de Haute Études en Sciences Sociales. Among his latest publications are La France sans le Juif, and also a book on the perseverance of the Jewish faith, a political theory of survival. Please, Dani. Not really? No. Here, you can use this.
Thank you. Thank you, Shai, for the invitation, and to all the organizers of this event. I'm happy to be there. I learned a lot. Because I have the microphone, I would like to say something about the conversation we had, but it's completely linked to what I will say. Completely linked. So first, I want just to say to David Feldman that the problem is in Christianity was the problem of contamination of Judaism. Jews were dangerous. Jews were dangerous. So you don't. Jews are always in the position to be potentially dangerous. I would like also to say something, because it's linked with my short talk, about the problem of invention. You know, invention of anti-Semitism. You know, you had the invention. You had the invention of the Jewish people, Shlomo Zant, and then you have the invention of genocide with Dick Moses. This brings to the question, when you have the invention, who takes the profit from the invention? And then you get to the problem of the Jews in Europe, okay? So I don't think it's a problem of paranoia, and even paranoiacs have enemies, you know, sometimes. So I will make a very short intervention. The talk of Bruno Chaouat is important because it answers. There was a question, what does it bring? It brings an answer to why Jews matter. Because I'm sure that in the audience some people say, okay, the Jews, how much are they? Why do this matter? And you have the explanation why it matters. It matters because they are embedded from the inception into the European identity and to the definition of what is modernity. And why does Europe matter? Europe matters because of globalization, colonization and globalization. So you have now global anti-Semitism. We have seen it in Durban. Okay. Now, 4 points and sentence of conclusion. In post-war Europe, anti-Semitism was criminalized. A French far-right author put it in a striking way. Hitler disgraced anti-Semitism. While there were anti-Semitic parties, anti-Semitic doctrines, anti-Semitic opinions, the term would henceforth consonant with evil. No one would endorse it positively. For some 20 years now in Europe, in France in particular, but not just in France, which includes almost half of the number of the Jews in Europe, we have been experiencing a strange situation. Hostility towards the Jews is finding new expression and producing massive effects. But the term anti-Semitism, since it has been rendered unavailable by the criminalization of the concept, is becoming an issue of contestation. As a result, the problem of new forms of hostility towards Jews has produced, symmetrically, the problem of the accusation of anti-Semitism. This has resulted in a big confusion in which hostility toward Jews is coupled with a discourse of victimhood in which one claims to be affected, defamed, insulted by the accusation of anti-Semitism. Second point. It is in this context of confusion that we want to establish definitions. Legal contexts need definitions, as do research contexts. Ordinary language is standardized, but the uses of words is free. It doesn't let itself be locked into shackles. Wittgenstein said the meaning of a word is in its uses. An example from my French experience. A retired officer interviewed on French television implicitly accused the Jews of having too much power, and he said, a certain community, you know who. And despite the insistence of the journalist, who repeatedly asked him, who, no answer was given. In the next day, we saw in protest demonstrations against the government's social policy, placards with the word who on them. Who? This example can be extended. One needs to be immersed in a context to understand what who means or what other words such as Zionist connote. Third point. The debates around the definition of anti-Semitism, I think, divide less the right and the left than progressive Israeli Jews and European Jews. This is the thing that I'm interested in. I'm simplifying, but this is the reason that leads us to misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is deep, maybe almost insurmountable. The Jewish Israeli subject, the Israeli citizen, is a direct product of the search of a definitive solution to the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. And the corollary is this. If he is left-wing and challenges the dominant Zionist ideology, he will be inclined to deny that there is any anti-Semitism in Europe. Inclined. Because reality contradicts him. More, he will be inclined to endorse the theme of the instrumentalization, illegitimate accusation of anti-Semitism, because he recognizes this form in the Israeli public debate. And what then happens that he confuses the claim of the Jews faced with hostility with the propaganda of the Israeli right. And he thus abandons to the Israeli right what he refuses to face. He then joins, without knowing it, those whose hostility toward the Jews in Europe is obvious. When I say obvious in the sense of Halbertal, the first day when he said, it stinks. Or when Joshua Shane said, I know it when I see it. But the Israeli citizen does not see what we see. No, I didn't finish. What we see, not because of bad will. His perception comes from his objective position. And from this blind spot, he will build alliances with the enemies of the Jews in Europe. I will finish, it's not long. Now, the birth of the State of Israel has transformed the condition of European Jews. This state, on the one hand, reassures them, but exposes them to criticism. Criticism, which is illegitimate in absolute terms, often carries with it a good deal of resentment towards the Jews. The motive of the liberation of the Palestinians and that of the liberation of Europe from the guilt of the Shoah in Europe are often linked. This kind of connection is not necessary, as we have seen, but it's either contingent. French philosopher Yankelevich summed this up in a very concise formula. Anti-Zionism is a godsend, is a gift. It gives everyone permission. It gives everyone the right, the duty to be democratically anti-Semitic. And he concluded, and if the Jews were Nazis, it would be so wonderful. This is why all the academic efforts, so numerous, to establish equivalences between the Shoah and colonial crimes, between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, between the state of Israel and the Nazi state or racist state, this is the reason why it blooms. And this semi-fraudulent work made by those who imagine themselves to be on the right side of the global left is painfully felt by the Jews in Europe. And here, the Palestinian cause seems to receive support, but this kind of support is, in my opinion, a trap. My concluding point is an address to my friends of the progressive camp in Israel. We understand your political disarray because we share your values and your concerns and even sometimes your anger. But don't worry about the censorship of criticism of the state of Israel in Europe. It's doing well. It has become the big signifier of being in the camp of the good. You can ignore the situation of the Jews who are targeted through this signifier, but by doing so, paradoxically, what you show is that you are Jews nationalized in the Jewish state, that you are pure products of Zionism, unable to have access to the Jewish condition. This is both your strength, the strength of the Zionist endeavor, and your weakness, your complete disconnection with the Jewish experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dani. Almost on time. Our next speaker on the panel is Professor Kalma Ben Yochanan, Chair of Jewish-Christian Relations at the Faculty of Theology at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Her book, Jacob's Younger Brother, Christian-Jewish Relations After Vatican II, was recently published with Harvard University Press. The book's Hebrew version has won the Shazar Prize. And we are also happy to have her here because she is a Polonsky alumni. please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I need a microphone, right? Thank you. So I have to say that I thought about what I'm going to say to you, and I rewrote it like, I don't know, 7 times perhaps from the beginning of the conference, and I keep moving between sides. So I hope you will find this also in what I am going to say, that there is no stability here, and I'm still moving. So I also have a Christian fetish, or a Jewish Christian fetish, maybe, and this is what I'm going to talk about, and I want to start with a personal experience. So when I was a postdoc here at the Leer Institute, I published a book in Hebrew on contemporary Jewish-Christian relations and the problems of Jewish-Christian reconciliation. And in this book, I showed that contemporary Orthodox halakha and theology returns to some of the hostile sources that are available in the Jewish tradition with regards to Christians and Christianity. Some of these parts, for example, the Talmudic excerpts that have to do with Jesus, were censored throughout the centuries, both from a Christian censor and also the Jewish community itself also internalized this censoring gaze. We could interpret it in different ways. And now, due to the fact of the State of Israel, these materials pop up. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. And I wrote specifically on Christians, I think, about the Goy. Maybe Adi would say something, of course, when we're not talking only about European Christians. And these sort of developments are exactly these conflations that we've been talking about between Zionism and theology and Judaism. So there is a lot of political theology to dig out from there, and it's very interesting. But I have to say that, except from criticizing and thinking about the very problematic political implications that such theologies may have on Palestinians, whether Christians or not, when you think about European Christians and theoretically about this surfacing, there is also something, I don't know, natural perhaps about that, right? We had centuries where the Jewish minority was oppressed within Christendom, and now when this oppression is, things are surfacing. Perhaps this is not only a horrible phenomenon, even though it can lead to horrible things. So yeah, there is a lot to think about there. And then I moved to Germany 2 years ago, and one of the first things that happened when I moved to Berlin was that some people in the Jewish community read the book in Hebrew, and they were completely scandalized by the book, and more than that, by the thought that this book will be translated into English, and God forbid, maybe also to German one day. And what they said is that, first of all, you don't know anything about our experience here in Berlin, in Germany in general. And what you're doing is, so you have this nuanced, critical Israeli approach to things that are happening in Israel, but you're actually smearing the name of Judaism altogether, and this poses a real danger to Jewish-Christian reconciliation and to our efforts to be somehow integrated into the German society. So, of course, the first response that I had to this criticism was, oh, censorship, right? It's censorship. I mean, it's scholarship, Wissenschaft. I have to be free to say my mind and also to criticize. And you're actually essentializing Judaism and saying that everything is perfect about Judaism. Why can't we say something critical about that as well? And then I sense that perhaps what I'm feeling is not only this scholarly identity thing, but also some kind of a negation of the diaspora, right? It's exactly the Zionist classical dictum that this is a negation of the diaspora, right? So, yes, and it was there. So, yeah, okay. So that's one thing. Eventually, I didn't censor, but I had to apologize, and I had to somehow, I understood that I had to recontextualize, and that I had to take seriously this criticism. I can't just dismiss this experience. It's a real experience. It's a different consciousness than the one that I was brought with, and of course other scholars also agreed that yes, indeed, other scholars that were more or less in my position in terms of the contents, that yes, indeed, their scholarship is often available on anti-Semitic propaganda websites. So this is something that I just have to, comply with it somehow. Okay, so that's one story that I wanted to tell you about the Judeo-Christian drama. And so this means that, right, I will cut it shorter. Okay. Another Judeo-Christian tension exists, of course, also on the Christian side of the equation. And in order to describe this tension, I would like to go back for a second to some of the basic structures of Christian attitudes to Jews and Judaism. We already talked about this actually right now, and this is interesting. But I wouldn't like to name this tradition anti-Semitism, nor even anti-Judaism, because these structures are not only anti. And this is precisely why they are complicated, and why, for me, anti-Semitism doesn't catch the heart of the drama here. So what is unique about Christianity's attitude to Jews and Judaism is not merely Judaism's othering, hatred, or discrimination, but the difficult mixture between measures of othering against the Jews, while at the same time treating the Jews as part of Christianity's self. Right? Classically speaking, they are Christ's enemies, but they are also Christ's kin. They are deciders, but the crime they committed is still a guilt shared by all of humankind and a metonym for sin in general. They are reprimanded for their refusal to the gospel, but this same refusal remains important for the fulfillment of God's plan of salvation. They are no longer the true Israel, yet they are still Israel, at least according to the flesh. They are accursed, but there is still hope for their conversion, what justified the continuous effort to civilize and to evangelize them. So at the heart of this Christian ambivalence towards Jews and Judaism stands the inclusion, of course, of the Old Testament, the inclusion, right, apropos Marcionism, the inclusion of the Old Testament in the Christian canon, the central pillar of Christian supersessionism. In Christian supersessionism, the new replaces the old, but not by completely negating the old, but by redeeming it, by transforming it, and by inviting all to be transformed by it. This is the ambivalent core. Basically, this means that Christianity cannot neutralize its relations with Jews, since it accepts Old Testament Judaism as an authentic revelation and as scripture, that is, Jews as those who were the chosen people. It can only affirm the continuity of this selection or to negate it as pertaining to the past alone, in a way that will suggest a Jewish loss of stature, right? What will be anti-Jewish. It's either a resonating affirmation or a radical negation. Neutrality is truly, unfortunately, not a possibility. When Christianity wanted to overcome its anti after the Holocaust, it retreated to the affirming part of this dialectic, to Jewish selfing, so to say. It affirmed the Jewish roots of Christianity, the essential connection between church and synagogue, and also affirmed that since the bond is so close and intimate, anti-Semitism is simply anti-Christian. And this has a double meaning. It's anti-Christian in the sense that it's against the spirit of the gospel, against the teaching, and it's also against Christianity. Basically, it's more about Christianity than about Judaism. I think this is meaningful in terms of understanding the current dynamics of the discourse, this discourse, at least as they take place in Germany and in the West more generally. On the one hand, the presence of Jews in Germany and the importance of the culture of Holocaust memory to German politics and the special tie with Israel is mirroring the theological insistence on reconnecting Christianity to its Jewish roots, which is now very widely accepted in post-Holocaust Western Christianity. Jews and Judaism are again important to Germany's self, and especially remembering Germany's Jewish past, with the Shoah taking the place of the Old Testament. It's about remembering Germany's sin that cannot be taken away by acts of repentance, in a way that resonates very closely with the Lutheran perception of the need to acknowledge the impossibility of self-justification and the need to overcome law in order to enter the realm of grace. It is in this sense Judeo-Christian to the extent that antisemitism threatens not only Jewish lives, but the identity of post-war Europe, so that antisemitism is anti-West, anti-Germany. This also explains why the accusation of antisemitism is transferred to Arabs, Muslims, and Germans of Middle Eastern background, if to use the German term, precisely as the non-West that has to be integrated, converted, so to say, to the Judeo-Christian through an affirmation of anti-Semitism. It is therefore no wonder that Israel is hugged by the Christian West and used as a weapon against, and perhaps as a missionary for the conversion of the East. This is how Christians are able to make use of the concept of the new antisemitism, and I'm not saying that this new antisemitism does not exist, in order to combat what in fact threatens not the Jews themselves, but the Christians and the secular West. So Arabs are accused of being anti-Semitic by Christian or Judeo-Christian Orientalists. But I don't want to stay there, because I think that the critique of Zionism on the left is not free of this Christian ambivalence to Jews either. After all, Europe is not only national, racist, and colonialist, it also sees itself as that which superseded, or at least laboring to supersede, nationalism, racism, and colonialism, not least because of its guilt for what it did to Jews in the Holocaust. Unfortunately, the only Westerners who seem to resist this new European lesson are the Jews themselves, who still stubbornly hold on to a European set of values that now became obsolete. Ironically, it was precisely those Jews whose collective crucifixion brought, so to say, light to the nations. But they seem to stubbornly refuse to acknowledge the universal meaning of their own suffering. Zionist Jews, according to this paradigm, suffer from false consciousness, or worse, they are purposely evil, and hold on to a colonial nation state in a stubbornness which, again, almost miraculously, insists on the land, on political messianism, and on ethnic particularism, precisely those attributes that were so often employed by Christian theologians to criticize Jews throughout the ages. Moreover, the meticulous separation between Zionism and Judaism implies that indeed only a remnant of Jews, a certain brand of diasporic Jews, a concept which, needless to say, is also prevalent in Christian theology, understand that Zionism is not a truthful interpretation of Judaism and can see the meaning that actually shines through the events. But of course, there is still always hope in Pauline terms that the Zionist branches will be grafted back onto the olive tree and all Israel will be saved. Amen.
Thank you, Karma. As you advertised, this was, one could see the movement in sort of in the argument. You started where Danny ended, and we'll see where this takes us. Our next speaker is Professor Adi Ophir, Professor Emeritus at Tel Aviv University and a visiting professor at the Kogut Center for the Humanities and the Program for Middle East Studies at Brown University, and before all that, here at Leer. Adi, it's great to have you here again. Please.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for these two and a half days from which I've learned a lot. And I came here really to learn and not to preach my doctrine, which I don't have yet. I will have. I'll try to reflect on what I heard, and to try to offer a kind of a more or less coherent concept of what we have done here. Because it was very different in various sessions, were sometimes very heated. We did not answer the question, what is anti-Semitism, until maybe the last session, with some glimpses here and there. We spoke about the definitions very little. There were some deconstruction, criticism of the definitions, but this was not at the center of these sessions. It was there, but it was not the object of the discussion. I think that the true object of the discussion that was there in the background all the time and mentioned in name several times is anti-Semitism. And I mean by this, anti-Semitism is a campaign. And I will speak about this campaign in a very simplistic way. I would love to join this theological discussion, metaphysical, philosophical discussion, but I'm not ready for this yet. So I would like to speak about this campaign of anti, for brevity's sake, anti. It's a network, a whole network of institutions, movements, all kind of groups of activists institutions at the level of the states, at the level of civil society, and others in universities and other forms of knowledge production. It is very much involved in knowledge production. This movement, this campaign. I think it is a very fluid constellation of forces, and a very interesting coalition of forces. And it is global. Of course, it has local manifestations, many local manifestations, but it is a global phenomenon. I just want to give it one example. A new Holocaust museum was established a few months ago with the help of Yad Vashem in Indonesia, where there are, I think, 100 Jews or something like this. And it was immediately sucked into a very deep controversy in Indonesia between two Muslim factions. And of course, the controversy was about Israel-Palestine. So there is diplomacy here, there is governmental apparatuses here, there are governmental apparatuses, there is knowledge production, ideology, law enforcement, education, memory, and of course, within and through all this, an ongoing construction of experience, and then a documentation of this experience, as we heard today. Now, this doesn't mean that there's no anti-Semitism. This doesn't mean that this documentation is in and of itself problematic, but I would like to offer the context in which all this is integrated. There are different actors with different interests and different things at stake in different places. And indeed, for progressive Israelis, different things are at stake than for Israelis. Different things are at stake than for Jews or Christian in the US or in France. I want to say a word about this scheme of knowledge that is at stake here. So first of all, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are conflated or somehow brought together in a kind of a semi-essential link. There is an underlying metaphysics that says anti-Semitic, why it is so awful, anti-Semitism, today. We just heard from Professor De La Pergola something about the number of Jews who were harmed physically. And you said it's minuscule. So it's not about this, it's about something else. But I think that there is an underlying assumption that anti-Semitic sentiments lead to anti-Semitic action, actions lead to pogroms, pogroms lead to genocide. Something like this. We are always on the slippery slope toward another Holocaust. Otherwise, what is all the fuss? Just relatively very few people are really hurt, killed. There are people who are forced to migrate. I accept this. I do not deny it. But relatively speaking, in the context of all the horrors around us, the horrors produced here, across the street, orchestrated from across the street. I mean, what is all the fuss? Now, this is not a denial of anti-Semitism. This is an attempt to understand the network and the knowledge that it is involved in this network. Now I want to say something about the definition. Of course, the definition is crucial for this production of knowledge. it is crucial for turning the campaign into a governmentalizing apparatus. And it is an instrument, or it is on the way to become an instrument of measurement. And an instrument of measurement is not independent of the object that it measures. It is part of the construction of the object. And it is the definition acts mainly, I think, as a vehicle for the dissemination of the problematization of anti-Semitism in various places. So we have a very thin, actually empty definition with 11 examples, but this was not good enough. So the EU produced, with the help of the Wiesenthal people from the Wiesenthal Center and others, I don't remember all the people who were involved, a handbook in which the examples were clarified with more examples. So the handbook gives you an example, a set of examples for each example. And with every example, anti-Semitism doesn't become more concrete, but just opposite, more abstract from the context in which it was the event was supposedly was taking place. How much time do you have? 2 minutes. Yeah. So I want just to say. So I said that from different in different locations, this constellation, this configuration of forces work differently in coalition with others. And I can say one thing about Israel-Palestine that was said here many times during the 3 days, but I would like to formulate it again. The effect of the campaign against anti-Semitism is simply not just shielding, not simply shielding Israel from the critique against what it has become. It is the discursive Iron Dome that is in operation today. It intercepts every argument about Israel. You cannot describe Israel as what it is in academic institutions, in the press, in other places. You cannot say that it is a settler colonial state. You cannot say that it is an apartheid state. You cannot say other things like other characterization like this. You can only say what we heard yesterday, Jewish democratic state. And we heard the interception, the autistic, this autistic envelopment, this autistic speech that envelops the speaker in a way that everything that was said is rejected, intercepted. We saw it yesterday in performance here on this place. Nothing can penetrate the speech of this lady. Nothing could penetrate it. And what we saw yesterday also in the same session, and I would like to end with this, was what I would like to call a counter-practice, Foucauldian counter-practice by Seth, who offered just an example of a so-called anti-Semitic incident and how it was taken care of in his institution under his guidance. Conversation, listening, explanation, education, some kind of relearning or unlearning history, etc. And okay.
Thank you, Adi. I can see already that there will be also inner conversation in the panel, but we need to wait. We need to wait for that because we want to hear Dr. Raif Zlek, associate professor at Bruno Academic College, where he teaches jurisprudence, property law, and culture. For me, he is the expert on Kant in the context of law and morality. He is also senior researcher at the Leer Jerusalem Institute and the academic co-director of the Minerva Center for the Humanities at Tel Aviv University. Raif, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank God my name is Zrek, so I speak the last speaker. And it's a great thing that a Palestinian will conclude an event on anti-Semitism. And in this sense, probably, I would question if we can run one conversation about anti-Semitism, or if there are, in fact, many, or should be many. In this way, following Bruno, probably my role as a Palestinian is to disturb the conversation. Because you can't make one conversation that it's true for France, Germany, and true for Palestine, Israel. So if I would be the non-integratable in the conversation, or then one that his non-integrability is non-integrable in this sense. So I'm a factor of disturbance, I would say. Because probably in Europe, I would want to stand with a wide definition of anti-Semitism sometimes. I don't want, as a Palestinian, because I'm anti-Zionist, anti-Israel occupation, to find myself sneaking into European conversation, where in France probably there are sentiments against Jews, and find myself sort of slipping into a conversation to narrow the definition. Probably there should be a wide definition. But the entry to Palestine is another entry. It's an entry of process of occupation, disposition, and decolonization. That's the main entry. There are many things along the way. And the victims could do mistakes sometimes. That happens all the time in history. But that is the entry to the conversation. That is the main vocabulary. Displacement, occupation, colonization. Then we can say many things about Hamas, about their charter, but that's the frame. And to put the two in one conversation, it's probably another mistake that European universalism is doing again. It's probably the time that we should break the conversation, make many conversations along the way. And given that, I mean, have many hats like many of you, but I speak here mainly as a Palestinian, not probably as a legal theorist or as a political philosopher, and as making this disturbance into the conversation. So I speak here and now. And we should be always aware, as practitioners and as theorists and as literary critic, as philosopher, that we start from certain place at certain point. And the place that I'm starting now here, last week, is that two ministers, former ministers in Israel, threatening 2 million Palestinians with a second Nakba because a few students raised Palestinian flag. This is the context. Here we are, Israel 2022. This is the context. Not to mention attacking funeral. These are what is at stake for Palestinians. So before condemning Palestinian to regimes of moralizing them, this is, so from Palestinian point of view, we experience the discourse on anti-Semitism as a regime of control. As Adi said, that's not the only thing, but that's the way we experience it. I'm not speaking from the point of view of God, I'm speaking from the point of view, how do I see and experience this? I experience this mainly that it has economy, it has political economy that runs it, it has funds, it has universities, it has institutions, it has money. But that doesn't mean, as Adi said, that there is no anti-Semitism. But someone mentioned Wittgenstein, the use. First of all, I see the use. And sometimes at speaking Wittgenstein, probably the use should be read with the thing in itself. It's not that the thing in itself then comes the use as something marginal. The use is part of the thing in itself. These are one phenomenon. That's not there's anti-Semitism and then there's anti-Semitism. We should read both of them as part of a... Now, I want to say a few things about definition and the problem of definition. One I've already alluded to is the problem of, can you really make so many things in the world, so many different phenomena, to put them into one just definition about is the relation of Jews in Gaza? Should we compare it to sort of middle class Catholic in Paris? I mean, shouldn't we make contextualization? So this is one problem. The other problem is, should we do for each and every group its own sort of definition of racism against that group? Should the Armenians, the Palestinians, now it's clear that the Jews have their special history. That is clear. But probably Germany and France and Italy should do a convention like that, a definition probably for those countries who persecuted the Jews. Probably they should have, regional, probably. But one should think how much we want to make that every group should have its own sort of definition of naming the racism against that group. I'm not sort of, I don't have a clear-cut answer to this question, I must admit. I must admit. So we have this problem of, and again the definitions, we saw the iris. Somebody from Venice, if he sees the iris, he says, it's bad. But when we saw how the repercussions of how the French parliament, the German parliament doing, so the uses of the definition should be read as part of the definition. But I want to say more about the political stakes. And I want to say something about the Palestinians' way approaching the definition. So I say that mainly it's felt as an act of censorship, as act of regime control, of moral regiming for the Palestinians. And I want to say something about the difficulty for Palestinians to sign any definition for anti-Semitism. Not bad ones, but also good ones. Because Palestinians they are the weaker part now in economy, their land being occupied, the process of settlement is ongoing, the process of disposition is ongoing, their life is not secured. So politically, economically, militarily, in any way, they are the weak part. So they are under constraint. There is a clear imbalance of power. Now, moral regiming is another mode of power. To put them another mode of constraint is also constraining. So no Palestinians want to sign on a statement that he finds that he's accusing another Palestinian of being racist, even if he thinks that the other Palestinian is wrong, that Hamas is wrong. that they shouldn't put in their charter. By the way, the charters have changed. Hamas is far more political and pragmatic than we imagine. But they wouldn't want to sign this. They probably want within the Palestinian community sort of to run a conversation that should be changed. But under these circumstances, they don't want to be part of sort of this self-regiming that is divisive. People under occupation and dispossessions, 2 minutes, they, first of all, they seek some power to empower themselves, to add division to themselves and to divide themselves more and more. This is really restraining. And you should listen to that and understand that sensibility. Now, does that mean that victims are immune? That they are carte blanche? I wouldn't say that. But there is a sphere of ambiguity that should be kept for those who are under occupation and their land being taken from beneath their feet every day, and their journalists are being killed, targeted in the middle of the day by official soldiers. Probably we should allow some moral rage to gain some power. But that's not a carte blanche. But where should we draw the line? I don't know, but probably Palestinians themselves should run this conversation. And the feeling that they, apart from being policed by police and by military and by America and by Israel, to add another mode of policing, it's really difficult, and I think it's really unwise, and I think it's not even conducive to the future of this place. I would stop here.
Thank you. We have about half an hour, and I want to get the audience here involved also, so it won't be only a closed conversation here. So just with the raise of your hand, show me if you want to enter now, or you, okay, not ready yet. So, Dani, back to you. But let's have it, let's try to have the conversation dynamic, so like 3 minutes, and so that we can actually have another round of the audience.
Yes, two reactions. The first,
a bit higher,
yes. Two reactions. The first for Diofir and for you, Professor Zreik. To Diofir, we are both sociologists, I think. You're not sociologist, I am. So I will talk in the name of sociology alone. You began, you talk about anti-Semitism, the campaign. And you said afterwards that the definitions you don't like are like an iron dome protecting Israel from critique. But as a sociologist, I would say if there are no missiles, there is no iron dome. So you have to, to take the two sides and see how they articulate together. When you define campaign anti-anti, you say it's a network of actors. It's global, it's loose, there is diplomacy. But in anti-Semitism too, this is a network, there is diplomacy, and there are multiple actors. So I would just suggest to have a symmetrical analysis of the situation. And to Professor Zreik, I would say that what you say reminds me the situation of the Jews in that sense, in a very specific sense. Like you said, Palestinians would sign on a document against anti-Semitism. But a lot of Jews in Europe, I think the vast majority, would sign for the right of the Palestinians. Why? Where is the problem? The problem is just what you said. In that circumstances, you say, they would not do it. we the same. In that circumstance of the situation of the Jews in Europe, it's difficult to sign a document in this, you understand? We are structurally in the same impossibility. We want to, and therefore it's very difficult for us to sign the Jerusalem Declaration.
Yeah. The difference, Israel has a state and a half, and the Palestinians don't have even half a state. So that's probably...
Yes, so I would be really, really brief. Lavi, so and you said it, you're not sure about that as well, but that the context should be somehow separated. And I'm wondering, so I would like to ask the both of you, to what extent do you think it's possible to separate, because it is also a global discourse, and you can't deglobalize it, right? That's the whole point, that we have this. So I'm just wondering, and also this is also for you, Danny, because stressing the European context, and this came up many times, it really looks like a completely different story, and each side, of course, accuses the other of conspiracy theories, and that's the whole point, right? So one victimhood is completely invented, while the other one is covering itself for it. So I'm just wondering, what do we do with it? If there is a way to hold these contradictions together, or we just have to simply switch the focus every time. And yes, and this is, it seems to me that your decision is not to go with the context. So, right, so it's only the Israeli-Palestinian context somehow that matters, so it seems. No, let me just, one more thing, so when you're saying that we saw that there are contexts in which people feel silenced exactly by the other side. So I'm wondering, what place does this have in your? Is it simply doesn't matter because the amount of suffering is incomparable? That's the.
It is, but
it is. Yeah, I agree that it is.
But this is not what I said. I said that this conglomerate, I don't know how to call it exactly, that. Huge very fluid apparatus, does different things in different places. And I only spoke about what it does here. I did not claim to say anything about anywhere else. It was too short to say anything. But I can respond to this comparison. I mean, I think it is almost impolite to describe the suffering of French Jews under anti-Semitism, whatever is this anti-Semitism in France, to what the Palestinians suffer every day. I mean, this is not of the same kind at all.
That's not what I compared. No.
Okay, so
I
okay.
compared the difficulty to engage.
Yeah, but the difficulty
is in the difficulty to engage in the side to engage with the other side, and the hesitation that it brings, like
so the difficult. So I would say the
comparing the situation.
I understand. I accept this, but I think that the difficulty, if this is the difficulty that you're talking about, is incomparable in the Palestinian condition. I would like to add just one word about my experience as a Jew living in the US, in the Northeast, for the last 10 years. Of course, it is completely different. There is no anti-Semitism in the street. There is nothing. There is Palestinian hatred in the street, in the Jewish street, a lot. I can, if I want to go to a synagogue where I can, gather with people with whom I can feel somehow at home, I will have to drive a long way to find some place like this. It is a very different experience. So I don't think that the experience of anti-Semitism is comparable across the globe, wherever it appears. And this doesn't mean that the network is not in operation globally. And I accept completely your comment about anti-Semitism itself as a network and a global, some kind of a global network. Yes, why not?
Yeah, I have 3 comments to make. One, the hesitation, I mean, Palestinian and Arab intellectuals issued a clear statement against anti-Semitism. So it's not that Palestinians, they're not ready to sign statements against anti-Semitism. The problems becomes more sensitive and more problematic as a political act is when you want to give a definition that relates to the situation in Palestine. Because we think the entry to the debate in Palestine is another entry. So we don't accept to be dragged to another kind of terminology to discuss the situation in Palestine. Now, some of us have lots of critiques on certain behaviors of certain groups, of certain people, but that's not the entry to the debate. The debate is situation of occupation and colonization, and it should be dealt this way. But there is, I just draw your attention to that, there is such a very high prestige, 137 intellectuals who issued a statement, one thing. Now, the other is, there is a difference between hesitation. I mean, I'm not a nationalist. I have an understanding of national mind and tribe mentality. But there is a difference when your tribe is on the defensive and when your tribe, that is the Jewish tribe, have a state and a half. You should have more confidence to critique a state that have the 5th army in the world. And I should have less confidence to critique my own people when they are daily being dispossessed. Now, the last note on definitions. The issue with the problem of definition of anti-Semitism as a global project, the problem with it is that the minute you do the definition, you find already yourself on the way to Zionism. Why is that? Because then you perceive that the Jews all over the world is one nation and facing one imminent threat from 3,000 years until now, and it's continuous. That's the issue, that it creates certain sensibility, because once you're on that track, you're already on the track to Zionism.
Just a second. Let's see. Let's take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and then.
I've got a loud voice. Don't worry.
No, it's not about the loud voice. It's about. That's right.
I'm a theatre specialist, so I know how to project. Okay.
Project ahead.
My first question is addressed to all of you, in fact. Why has the debate on defining anti-Semitism arisen now? Amidst all kinds of manifestations all over the world which are anti-Semitic. I'd like to hear what explanation you can give for that. I've got an answer, but I'm not going to propose it. I've asked a question. All right.
Okay.
So I guess I'm curious to hear if there's some time at the end, if there are plans on where to go with this, on where to go with this afterwards. And one thing that I wanted to ask about is, I'm increasingly perplexed by what seem to be real differences around anti-Semitism and therefore anti-Semitism definitions with respect to Europe and the United States. This goes back to your point about geographies, which I don't think was covered. So I'd be interested to hear from you guys, and anyone really, about whether definitions or other things can kind of do something to somehow connect or bridge gaps that I'm hearing coming up around the politics and power of anti-Semitism in these diasporic places. Thanks.
Okay. Any other question? So let's conclude our panel by final words from all participants. There was a question? Oh, I missed it.
Before my question, I wanted to make sure, Danny, did you say that the Israeli intellectual doesn't understand the Jewish condition and does not view him herself in a way as responsible for the problem of anti-Semitism? I just want to make sure I understood you before I ask my question. Yeah? Did you say that? No, I didn't ask my question yet.
Exactly.
Okay, close enough.
No.
Yeah, close enough. Okay. Thank you, Shai.
If I didn't say you don't take responsibility, I say you don't see it. It's
Okay,
not the same
okay,
thing.
it's even worse. Thank you. So, Danny, we have this conversation, and it has been so interesting to have this conversation with you throughout the years. And I'm still amazed every time you say it. Because, for one thing, I mean, I think, first, it's as if you wanted to define the entire Jewish people through anti-Semitism and define the Jewish condition through that. I mean, you're going even further than Sartre, and Sartre was highly criticized for doing something that but he's not even doing that, because at least, he's trying to find some categories to oppose inauthentic and authentic Jews. But, I'll leave this on the side. Israel, if you want to use a Sartrean terminology, at least claims, whether it succeeds or not, it's another issue, but at least wants to be the authentic Jew. That is, the one who turns the table on the anti-Semite and defines him herself in a way that is independent from the gaze of the anti-Semite. So that's the authentic Jew, and I think, the Zionists didn't read Sartre, of course, but that's what I wanted to achieve. And of course, in that respect, an authentic Jew, according to that definition, should not be too troubled by this. Israelis have an army, they make history. Jews are the object of...
Eva, you gave the answer. The last sentence, you gave the answer. They are authentic Jews, so they don't need to carry so much about. That's the answer.
No,
you
but
gave it
no. Let me continue. Another way to say this is through a different terminology, is that the Jews outside of Israel are a minority, and here they are a majority, and not only a majority, they are an oppressive majority. That means they have completely different political identities, and you cannot obliterate these political identities when you think about the relationship that should exist between the intellectual and the rest of the Jews. So one of the issues that I think you raised towards the end, all of you in the discussion, which was absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to flatten it, it's the issue maybe of the tension between the loyalty to a group, especially when that group is oppressed and attacked, and I think Raif put this very beautifully, and the tension between that and universalist ethics. Now, we are at a point of time when our group, the Jews, whatever that is both attacked outside Israel and attacks in Israel. So, maybe, so I don't know exactly how you, what you want is just erase one side of the equation and look at only the other. That, I don't know what would be the term, Bruno helped me in English, ça serait du pur dolorisme. Yeah, that would be just, yeah, that would be just having a lacrimosal relationship to the Jewish people. That's.
Thank you. Okay, so
I will do it.
Ezra, very briefly, and then.
Thank you. Well, maybe you will think this point is totally marginal and you'll say, why are you even introducing it? But I wanted to introduce philosemitism, you know, the other side of the coin, you know, Karma's examples, if you spent any time in Germany as a Jewish person, probably you encountered it. But the very interesting thing is it is not only in Germany. I'm also a scholar of conversion, and I have a graduate student who was going to work on conversion to Judaism in LA. There is a rabbi who does these mass conversions, but then it, you know, COVID happened, and then we said, okay, why don't you do it online? So she has been looking at online conversions. There are also rabbis who do that, and she realized that there are people from all over the world, tons of people from the Middle East, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, you know, so of course, we don't know if these people will complete it, if they will ever join Jewish communities. I cannot tell you if this is statistically significant or not. But when she talks to them, many of them mentions, well, I feel like a Jew because I feel oppressed for X, Y, Z. Many of them say they feel like they are reborn Holocaust victims. You can say, okay, these are the crazies, but you know, there are always lots of crazies. Crazies sometimes lead the world. So, you know, I can't even give a good analysis of the situation, but I'm wondering this defining anti-Semitism and making one anti-Semitism kind of homogenizes the Jewish experience. Then the Jew becomes the one who has been a victim of the Holocaust. And then when people desire that and want to convert to that, anyway, I'll just put it on the table.
Thank you, Ezra. So we'll now have 2-3 minutes for each of the participants, and we'll conclude. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. First of all, to Professor Shai, I'm very conscious that the internal Jewish conversation takes the Palestinian in hostage, that they feel that they are caught in a conversation where they do not participate. No, I think that's just, I would not, I think there is a way to enter the conversation, but we have no time. The second question was, why now? Why now? This is, in my opinion, the crisis of left identities, since left identity, from the left identity, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, where we had a left which was structured around the working class, and this place is now empty, and we have to fill it. And I think Palestinians are victims of this emptiness, because they come in the middle. They are not the only ones, but for example, Palestinians, they take the place there, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work, okay? So that's the explanation why now. And second to Eva, and I finished, that's the beginning of a conversation we need to have. You said we have two separate identities. So the question, are we one people or two peoples? Maybe there are two peoples there. It might be, but the conversation will tell us. Chaouat?
I don't think I need the whole of the 3 minutes, but I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, why exactly now, but it seems to me that if anti-Semitism was some kind of a unifying factor in terms of Jewish peoplehood, then now the conversation is less on or also on anti-Semitism, but clearly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something that no Jew in the world can ignore. This is somehow the heart of what now frames the questions of Jewish identity, and this is.
It shouldn't.
I don't know if it should or not. I think this is my observation.
For a conference is fine. I understand, because here we're all academics and we have to discuss. But nevertheless, I'm afraid we've made the politicus and history made a sort of a breaking wall. Sorry.
So I don't know. I'm not. I don't want to answer to the question of should, but it seems to me that this is becoming the fact. So this is becoming, and that's a central question, and it's a central question precisely because since anti-Semitism is also one of such central questions, they have to somehow conflate. So they have to be taken together. This is my opinion, and this is what I also, I think what I want to do is really to think about these contradictions and to see how they can be carried somehow together without, without doing this necessarily peacefully, but to do something with this. So that's one thing, and I think it's also interesting. I mean, it's a continuation of what I'm saying, actually, but it's very interesting to see how we have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the one hand, and the question of the relationship within powerful Judaism and diasporic Judaism together, and these two divisions, these are also divisions that have to somehow correspond with each other, so it seems to me.
I think that, I don't know to answer the question why now, but I know what the anti campaign does, and you can draw.
No. There were two parts to my comment. Excuse me.
No, you're not the chair. I'm sorry.
Why now?
I'm sorry.
Why now, amidst the manifestations of anti-Semitism?
No, but
we're in Israel, so you can do that. Yes.
I want to say, to point out three main things that the campaign does in different ways, and they are related, but they are not the same, they are distinct. One I mentioned before, the interception of criticism of Israel. The other is problematization of anti-Semitism that makes anti-Semitism a replacement of the Holocaust as the core of Jewish identity, or the conflation of Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism as an identity, a motor of identity, can function as the glue that connects us all, Jews, in those various communities. It can function as what makes one a Jew when one doesn't pray, one doesn't study, one doesn't go to the synagogue on Shabbat, but one is insulted as a Jew. The third thing, which is, I think, something that Karma addressed, is that anti-Semitism is a kind of at the center of a coalition, a Jewish-Christian coalition, whose purpose is to be to create a wall, or to create a division between the Jewish-Christian West and the rest. And the rest is mainly Islam, of course.
Yes, I think there are two partners to this process, and one should ask what is the interest of each of them. One is the government of Israel, and the second mainly Europe. So the Israeli interest is clear in de-Arabization of the conflict, and after two intifadas where it's becoming more and clear that the Palestinians having moral ground, that their case is becoming more visible as moral case, unlike the 50s or the 60s. So anti-Semitism is always a reservoir of gaining higher moral ground by conflating Israel. You don't agree? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. So that's why Israel is interested. Now, another question, why is Europe and the US is agreeing to this game? There are many possible answers. One of them is probably they feel good about themselves. The Jews are the ultimate other. We are defending the Jews. We're okay with ourselves. The attitude to Jews in post-World War, it's a kind of the way that middle-class rebel defined himself. One of the ways is how do your attitude to the Jews. Now, when you're tolerant to the Jews and defending them, you can fuck the Muslims.
Okay, so okay, so still, I don't want to end on that note. So I'll just try to conclude in a different way. I think one of the lessons from the past 2.5 days is perhaps the importance of having this kind of conversation. I'll put it in a way that not everybody will agree, but there's only one, even if definitions are bad and very bad, there's only one thing worse than the worst thing is having only one definition. And so I think that at least in that sense, the conversation here has opened up different possibilities and different conversations. And where do we go from here, David, I think is a good question, whether we're climbing with the definitions up the Wittgensteinian proverbial ladder, and now it's time simply to let the ladder go. Thank you all.